All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. I'm here with Bob Gross. It's March 28th, 2023. We're at Cooper Mountain Vineyards. Bob, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
First question to get you started is why wine?
Why wine? Of course, as you know, I have other interests. So it all kind of, it's kind of how did it really start? When I was really, the real first wine tasting I did when I was about 10. My grandmother, who was born in Hungary, introduced me to Tokaj Aju, which is a Hungarian wine. And you know, I was in college or after that, well, I was young at the time, but then I offered to college and always was thinking about Tokaj Aju. Then I went ahead and went to Georgia Tech, and where I majored in biological engineering because I was going to be pre-med. And that was the only kind of way, the only pathway at Georgia Tech. And I was at Georgia Tech because I lived in Atlanta, and it was a great school where I could live at home and go to school and get a degree without costing too much money. But in the biology department, which was part of the degree, obviously, bioengineering, there was a fermentations course. And a guy named Dr. Peter Gaffney was teaching it, and he was taking us through all the different fermentations like cheese and wine. Of course, Atlanta was pretty dry back then, so we weren't really allowed to taste what we were making. But that was really kind of my introduction to wine, understanding that it was a very biochemical process, and that we were prepared, as a bioengineer, to go in that direction if we so desired. But of course, the desire then for me was to go to medical school. And in medical school, there was even more biology and even more biochemistry. So after graduating from medical school and doing an internship and a residency in Connecticut, the military placed me for a couple of years as a doctor in a place called Mountain Home, Idaho. And that was really the first time I had gone over the Rocky Mountains. And at Mountain Home, we were fortunate enough to kind of see some of the beginning of the Idaho wine industry. And vineyards were growing, and people were starting. And some of us from the Air Force Base got interested in the grapes and founded a little thing informally called the Merry Winemakers of Mountain Home. And at one point I was president. But, you know, and that was, all the grapes were really, some of them were made from Idaho, but most of them were imported from California in the form of juice. But that, again, got me introduced to making and drinking wine. And so after leaving there, I ended up in Seattle at the University of Washington. And there was a group of doctors there that had been making wine in the Pike Street Market, about 10 people. And they invited me to be a part of it because I just happened to be there at the time and showed an interest. So that was a real first time that I was making a lot of wine, because there were 9 or 10 of us about, and we would make, you know, several hundred cases for all of us. But it got to be big enough to where, you know, the general principles of making wine in a little bit more than your home was needed. So the process and how to go about doing it was, we refined it. One of the founding guys was a guy named Hans Dorr, Dr. Dorr, and he was a European, and so he knew a lot about wine. As a matter of fact, he went ahead after they kicked us out of the Pike Street Market to form something called French Creek Wineries in Woodinville, which was in existence for a short while. But meanwhile, my wife and I, Corrine, because I got married in this interim, who was from Portland, decided we were going to move down here to Portland because her family was here, and also because I had an interest in Pinot Noir grapes. And the group up in Washington was all about Cabernet grapes. And so I had heard about Dick Erath and what he had done, and David Lett. So it just so happens that a piece of property was for sale through kind of my wife's godfather, which is now Cooper Mountain Vineyards in the area of Beaverton and Aloha. It was up for sale. He was selling it, and it was going to be a development. But when he found out that we were interested, because possibly interested, we came down here, looked at it, and here it is on a southwestern slope, and it was perfect. So this was a place where my wife had ridden horses when she was young, and we got back to that, and so she knew, this was kind of a part of her way back when she was 10 years old, 12 years old. So we ended up purchasing it, and with the idea of growing grapes on it. And of course, then the question is, where are you going to get the grapes from? Well, you just call Mr. Erath and Dick Erath in at the time, and he'll kind of get you started. So that's what I did, and he sold us a bunch of grape cuttings, told us where to put them, how to start everything, and that's how it all started.
What year was that you purchased this?
About 1978.
I want to come back to all of that, but I want to talk about the other part of your life. We kind of fast forwarded through there. So tell me why medical school, and what did you determine to be your specialty in medical school?
Well, I was always interested in physiology and the way the human body operated, and also the mind, and how the mind influenced the body. So during my medical school career, I was exposed to a lot of people from obstetrics and gynecology, and the hormones and the physiology associated with reproduction. So I ended up doing some training in obstetrics and gynecology, and that's how I got into. That's what I was doing in the military. I was the chief of OBGYN at Mountain Home Air Force Base. So, but my real interest always had been in what was called psychosomatics. That was the influence of the mind on the body. So after practicing OBGYN a couple years in Seattle, I decided that I would like to learn more and specialize in that part of OBGYN. And so I went over to the medical school, University of Washington, and they kind of put me in the direction of the psychiatry department, since it was mind-body that I was interested in, and also the OBGYN department. And they said, sure, you could come here and do some studying, actually do some residency for a couple of years, and if that's what you're going to get out of it, to be a specialist in psychological aspects of women's diseases. And after being there 2 years, it was only going to be another year before I became a certified psychiatrist. So I just stayed on. And then they asked me to join the psychiatry department and the OBGYN department at the University of Washington, where I taught for a couple of years and did some research. But it was really the idea of coming down to Portland, joining Corinne's family, and the pull of the grapes that brought me down here. But also, I mean, psychiatry was easy. I mean, there were a lot of spots here, and so I joined the VA and did some did some consulting in the Department of Psychiatry here, and then also set up a private practice. Now, it all kind of fell together because the other problem was it became obvious to me if I was going to do anything with grapes and wine, I couldn't be an obstetrician. It just was not practical. But I could be a psychiatrist because you have so much control of your time. And you can, the idea is that you really can adjust it how you want. Like at harvest, I could take that time off, but you can't do that with OBGYN. So,
you don't say.
So I kind of veered in that direction for that reason. And also, so that's why we came down here, to practice psychiatry and to open a vineyard and a winery. So we planted the grapes with the help of local people. As I said, I being a bioengineer, applied biology from Georgia Tech, I could pick up the textbooks on wine and winemaking, most of which came from the University of California, Davis, and I could understand it because I had the background for it. And my wife had the background for growing things. So I could make the wine and she loved putting in the plants. And so we were a good combination. So we planted the grapes, and after about 3 or 4 years, some grapes came out, and we started making some wine in the garage of the house I live in right now. And we did that for a few years until all of a sudden we had a lot of grapes. And we were up to about 15 acres. And it became apparent that this wasn't going to be just a hobby, you know, that there were a lot of grapes there. So we started selling grapes. We sold some to Ponzi, we sold some to Elk Cove, the Campbells, and somehow Myron Redford was associated with it all, and he sold us some grape plants as well. And so we were off. And then we ended up planting this whole thing of about 25 acres. And hired Rich Cushman as a consultant. Rich has helped a lot of people get started in winery, and of course he still has a winery of his own. But he did a lot of consultation, and so he helped us buy the bigger equipment, and so we started making the wine in the garage, and eventually outgrew it, and ended up making wine in this building right here, which was a horse stable. And then we outgrew that, and then we built other buildings over here. Now, one of the problems is that it turned out that this area that we bought this farm in is so close to Aloha and Beaverton that it was influenced a lot by the zoning of the county, which saw this as long-term development, not as farm. Yet across the street is where the farm began. The EFU land started across the street and goes for miles and miles and miles, but we were on the other side. So we were handicapped from the very beginning with how much we could do here, and we still are. And so when we then ended up buying another piece of property east of here, which we call Meadowlark, and which was about 40 acres of grapes, which then turned out, since it was closer to the city, and ended up being annexed into the city of Beaverton. And it became apparent that we just couldn't continue to farm it with that many people around. So we knew that was going to be, eventually just couldn't be. But we did buy it in 1985 or 84 or something like that, and we just recently sold it. So we had 40 years out of it. And then we bought another piece of property on Farmington Road, further down, another 40 acres, and then we ended up buying another 40 acres in Cornelius area. And we started just increasing the size of everything. And of course, somewhere along the way we outgrew Rich Cushman, and interim wise we had Bill Fuller. Yep, because he sold his place and he was with us for a couple of years. John Eliason was with us a couple of years, but eventually Sheil found us. And so he ended up being our winemaker, and he's been that way for 15 to 20 years. He came from Bridgeview. I'll give you another question now.
Perfect. Perfect. Before we get in, I'm curious about, you talked about the growth of this place, and I'm curious about that, but I'm also curious about your initial impressions of Oregon's wine industry when you moved here, and your interactions with some of the founders of the industry. What did you think of the people who were making wine here at that point?
Well, it was I didn't even think of it as an industry. I mean, there were only about, I don't know, actually 20 or 30 vineyards or wineries in the whole, or all of Oregon. So it really didn't occur to us that it was an industry. Because there were a bunch of individuals, and it's not like we met, to consult with each other all at once in one place. I mean, gradually over the years that would happen with the Oregon Wine Association and the Oregon Wine Board, but that didn't start that way. I mean, it was really, you would just go over there, I'd go talk to Dick, and then of course the other Dick Ponzi was right down the street, and would consult with them informally. But it was apparent we couldn't sell all the wine ourselves, so we found out there were things called wine wholesalers in Oregon. And so we ended up starting with, which I'm trying to remember, we've had a string of wholesalers over time. One of which was Valley Wine, which was owned by Gallo, and then Southern. I mean, they just got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that kind of became the industry. We didn't understand that part of the industry because everything we were selling was just right out of here. We didn't know that much about how you go about selling wine in stores. But we did. We connected up with wholesalers, and they taught us that, and then we realized we had more grapes than even here. We went up to Washington and expanded that way.
So as you were meeting, especially with Dick Erath and getting cuttings from him, what did you start to learn about growing grapes specifically, or about starting a vineyard specifically, that maybe you didn't expect?
Well, I guess I didn't expect the lack of certitude. You know, that I think it certainly didn't occur to us to really understand terroir very much. It never occurred. I mean, soil was soil in our minds. Because I never had any farming training, but to me, I mean, it wasn't that big a deal. Mm-hmm. And of course, as time went on, we understood that soil was most important, and the sense of place was most important, and altitude was important, and all the different drainage issues. I mean, it became apparent that each site that we had bought was quite different. The soils were different, the drainage was different. The particular clones, which we discovered of Pinot Noir particularly, were all different and suited maybe for one place over another place, and including Chardonnay was that. So it obviously became more complicated. As we expanded, we understood the differences.
Mm-hmm. So you started off planting organically from the beginning. Tell me about how that came to be.
I wouldn't say we started out organic. No, we were just regular farmers.
Okay. So what caused the change?
I think a gradual awareness of the damage environmentally and health-wise that chemicals that were being used in the industry could have to just about everything. One of the things that I remember in about somewhere in the mid-'80s was using a chemical called Measurol, which is, I mean, I'm a doctor. I use medications. I'm not against medications, but I wasn't really aware. I mean, I guess I was aware of some of the side effects of medications, but that never really translated into farming, the farming part of me. But what I gave this Measurol was a wonderful chemical, sold to us as a wonderful chemical that would keep the birds away from the grapes. And you sprayed it on, and the birds got sick. They vomited, and then they told all the other birds that this is not anything that we want to eat. And so I think we all thought it was just a godsend having this chemical there, because before that we had to use noise and everything we could to keep the birds off at harvest. But when the birds went in, you would just watch them fly in, and they would act sick, and only one or two of them would do that, and then all the rest of them would fly away. So we were really, really pleased with that, until Canada decided that there may be something toxic about this. And it turns out that even though it was advertised as kind of disappearing when you harvest the grapes, it didn't. It went into the grapes. As a matter of fact, it's been shown to cause Parkinson's disease and a lot of other diseases. This is a neurotoxin. And Canada was smart enough to actually look in the wine, and there was residual there. And so it was taken off the market. But I mean, that was pretty scary, because that was very direct evidence of what we were putting in the grapes. We were told it was safe. but it turned out not to be safe. And so I think with that awareness, and just a general doctor's awareness, I became very, very suspicious of what chemicals in the vineyard can do to the wine and what people drink, and also the workers, because they were spraying the chemicals. Originally, I was one of the people that was spraying the chemicals, and there was one called paraquat that turned out to be, I mean, a real poison, and it's still, I think it's still being used. But there were a lot of chemicals that way, and so my wife and I were really not happy with having to use chemicals, and so we narrowed it down as much as we could. And then, of course, we became familiar with the organic movement, and so in around 1990 something, we started trying to make the switch to organic. And I mean, of course, there were other people doing it, and so we knew it was possible. So the approach, my approach was more than just being interested in the lack of chemicals, in terms of minimizing the amount of chemicals, because at the same time, my wife was very ill with cancer in the mid-90s, and I was watching her being treated with chemotherapy, and it occurred to me that chemotherapy was a lot like some of the chemicals that we were using on the grapes. That basically the philosophy was the same. It was you use a silver bullet to kill the cancer, or to kill the bacteria or the molds or anything in that went on the grapes, that botrytis and so on, fungi. But the approach was to use a silver bullet to kill it. And then I got exposed through my medicine and acupuncture into alternative medicine and homeopathy, and the whole idea of alternative agriculture came to me at the same time. And I mean, maybe other people were thinking the same way, but alternative agriculture became an interest to me. And then I learned about Rudolf Steiner and biodynamics, and was fortunate, again in the mid-1990s, to be exposed to Alan York, who was from California and had started with Fetzer and Benzinger, and showing them how to use the philosophy of anthroposophy, which is biodynamics, with grapes. And so Alan, it turned out, had been hired by Mr. Benzinger, who was trying to start a vineyard here right off of Chehala Mountain. And so somehow Alan and I got contacted each other, and so Alan was able to start us on the path to biodynamics, because his benefactor was really Mr. Benzinger, who was pretty established and had a lot of resources. So Alan came here, and he's very energetic and very idealistic Californian. And so our first consultation was very eye-opening to me, because Alan said, okay, he came over here and said, let's go look at the plants. And he said, you have a shovel? I said, well, what do we need a shovel for? He said, well, that's where we're going to dig in and see what's in the soil. I said, well, that's a kind of a novel idea. Because before that, over the years, we'd had consultants from Davis, University of California, Davis, who came to Oregon, and they never even looked at below their feet. They're always looking at the top part of the plant. Alan wasn't interested in that. He was interested in the soil and in the roots. So he starts going through the vineyard, digging, and said, you don't have any earthworms here. I said, well, that hadn't occurred to me. He said, your soils have been killed by all the chemicals that you've sprayed on. And I just was devastated. I had no idea that this was killing anything in the soil. So we obviously made a big switch and started paying attention to what was in the soil and started using the approach of Rudolf Steiner and biodynamics, putting compost in, and then putting homeopathic quantities of different things like dandelions and so on, yarrow on the plants, which fit with my medical thinking, which had been exposed to homeopathy by Hahnemann. It turned out that Hahnemann influenced Steiner into doing the same type things, spraying infinitesimally small amounts of natural substances to act as catalysts to help the plants grow.
What was that transition process like once you start down the biodynamic path? How long did it take you to get your vineyard to where you were happy with it?
Well, it takes 3 years for certification, and I would say, that first year or two, particularly, the plants are really pretty shocked, because again, what we're trying to do with biodynamics is have the plant be stronger to where it can fight off natural diseases by itself. The idea of wellness in plants, to make them a stronger host. And so we immediately, when you first do it the very first year, it's kind of like the plants are feeling very vulnerable. Everything that had protected them before is gone. It's kind of like they had a shield around them, and then the shield had to drop, and they had to learn how to fight things off themselves. And so, first year or two particularly, a lot of diseases occurred. But amazingly enough, they began learning how to fight off the diseases. And so the amount of chemicals that were needed were way less than before, and we use different chemicals. It's not, organics is not lack of chemicals. It's lack of non-man-made chemicals. But as we know, cyanide can kill, and it's a natural occurring substance. So you can't just use any chemicals. But it's amazing that the grape plants really don't need that many chemicals, organic chemicals, to keep them healthy.
What did you notice about the vineyard as it got into biodynamic status, and as it grew and aged? How has it changed?
Well, the magic word was balance. Things were we didn't realize how out of balance they were in terms of looking at the grapes and looking at the shoots and looking at the leaves and the soils. Things became into balance. And of course, the flavors were changing in the grapes, because the goal was not really just to make them more and more grapes, which was, I think, originally all of our grape goals originally. It was now to focus on quality, and the grapes yields went down Not a huge amount, but they did go down to start with, and then they came back. But the flavors were much more in balance. And again, I think it was because they were more able to adjust to the different soils for themselves rather than having man help them out.
So you talked earlier about finding Gilles as your winemaker. Tell me about the process of bringing him on board and what he has brought to your team.
Well, I guess Gilles had been a pretty traditional winemaker down at Bridgeview, but he was very attracted to coming up here because he knew that's not what he was going to do up here. And it turned out again, I mean, over the years I have taken trips to France and to South America. And they were, as usual, ahead of us. I mean, there were a lot of places that had become organic, and a lot of places that had become biodynamic ahead of us. And Gilles was quite aware of that. So he was totally on board to working on that. The other thing about Gilles that's different than the American winemakers is that he's what's called a vigneron, which is they don't believe in the term winemaker because wine is made in the fields, it's made in the grapes, and so he really was quite different than the other winemakers that we've been associated with because he was really looking at the plants mostly. And so when we went organic and biodynamic, he was 100% on board. And I'm not sure we could have done it without his help.
So you talked about the growth of the business, obviously buying more vineyards and expanding. Tell me what you've looked for in new vineyard sites, why you've chosen the places you have, and how they've sort of added to what you've wanted to do with the business.
Well, the advantage, I mean, the ones here in Washington County, all of the vineyards here, we planted all of them, and so it's kind of like a big mystery. You don't know really what's going to come out. You try to get, we got more sophisticated in terms of soil analysis and having consultation about what grapes would grow where and so on, but you really never know. And one of the reasons you never know is that, like, we would buy 40 acres. It turns out maybe 2 acres would grow great grapes, and maybe 10 acres would be just average. And you never would know until it's been 4 or 5 years. But it wasn't anything to buy, and so that's what we pioneered, basically that. But then after several years, and now our recent expansion into Yamhill County, we bought things that were already growing, and we could taste the grapes in the wine. I mean, all of them, all the vineyards that we bought, including Dick Erat's vineyard, have a track record now. Back then there was no track record, but now now we're looking for track records, and so we're able to do that. And so buy vineyards that are available, which of course is still pretty rare, and try to get the ones that would fit into what we're looking for.
And what is that? What are you looking for?
Well, we're looking for that balanced flavor that it's hard to describe because there's no one Pinot Noir. There's no one Pinot Noir style. There's no one type of Pinot Noir. We have a bunch of different type of clones. Some of them are very elegant. Some of them have a lot of backbone, and some of them can age a long time. Some of them can't. And so it's got an individual style that we've been interested in. That's hard to describe, but I would say it's more old world rather than new world. And of course, Gilles has influenced on that. But you can't you have to find the grapes that fit. You can't fit the grapes onto the soil. You have to find them, the perfect spot for them.
Tell me about balancing the various businesses for yourself. Obviously, you had your own practice. You have this business. How have you balanced this as both have grown up?
Well, I've balanced it with a lot of help. That's what I've learned. I mean, I'm not proud in terms of asking for help. And so I've tried to find the best consultants, the best people, not just consultants, but people that have good character and are reliable and responsible and are passionate about what they do.
Obviously, we met your daughter earlier, who's come into the business. Tell me about her entrance into the business.
You know, they were raised right here on the farm, the vineyard, and Barbara really took a real early interest in it, and started working in it in some form or another, probably in high school or early college. And so over the last 20-something years, she's continued to learn more and more about the business, and now she was very active in the Willamette Valley Association, and also in the Pinot Noir camp. And so she's just grown with the industry, to be honest with you, because, you know, 20 years is, the industry really isn't that old.
Were you excited when she got excited about the industry?
Yeah, I mean, it was wonderful to have somebody in the family to think that they're going to carry on with it. I mean, it's rarer than we think.
So I'm curious. I want to go back. I'm going to kind of go out of sequence here for a second. I want to back up to you started making wine, Washington. You found your way down here. Tell me about how. I guess. How did you think it would work? Did you always think that you'd be able to make wine successfully? Was it like once it became part of your plan? Did you know it was going to work?
Well, I was, you know, as I said, I feel like I'm a second generation pioneer, not a first one. And the first generation showed us that it could work, and that there could be a business. And you know, David Lett's appearance in 1975 in France. I mean, we were pretty assured that it could work. But again, since I was always, my income was really mostly from being a doctor. I think I only gradually decided that financially that there was some stability also coming from the wine business.
And what was interesting to you about Pinot Noir when you first wanted to make it here? Why Pinot?
Well, I mean, it was either Pinot or Cabernet. I mean, Chardonnay was there too, but it was either Pinot or Chardonnay or Cabernet, and the two couldn't be more different. Some have been described as masculine and feminine. One is bold, and the other is more subtle, more refined, and more elegant. And that was the style that I was most interested in, the more elegant, nuanced, subtle style.
So tell me about the growth of the Oregon wine industry. Obviously, you've seen a lot of growth in the Oregon wine. You've seen almost all of the growth of the Oregon wine industry. What are the biggest changes that you've seen come to the industry, and what does the industry look like to you now compared to what it used to be?
Well, I think today it's in a transition. Originally, again, it was little mom and pop businesses. Even Erath and all the rest of them couldn't be described as much more than a mom and pop operation. And then bigger companies got interested. One of them even got interested in us for a while. San Michel purchased a few thousand gallons of our grapes and made the wine. We started crushing them here and took them over to Eastern Washington. A guy named Doug Gore, who was ended up to be their president of wine operation, San Michel. And they got very interested they were just experimenting with the grape. And it was an eye-opener to me to see, how big a giant company like that, how they operated. I mean, it was very different than us here. And it really wasn't, they had their little secret experiment, essentially, that we were helping them with. The next thing we knew, they bought Vineyards. So, it was an eye-opener in terms of what big business could do. They were a stock market company.
You talk about being in a transition now. What is the transition you're seeing?
Well, it is not just recently, but over the last several years. We've become part of an international community and an international business community. The French have come here and bought lots of land, and other people from all over the, other wine business people have come from all over the world and have started buying things here, which is actually making it more difficult for us local people, because their resources are way different than ours. Venture capital people, all that's kind of new. And so, what's the future going to hold? I still think it's going to be like Burgundy, where you're going to have people like us that are family businesses that hopefully could have gone on for hundreds of years, and that are not giants. But then there are some in Burgundy that are very big companies. But there's plenty of room for both. And Pinot Noir is different than Cabernet also in that it's much more susceptible to changes in soil and in climate, and so 5 acres can really sustain somebody if it's Romani Conti. It's really possible to have a world-class income and everything on 5 acres, which is that's not very likely in Cabernet or Bordeaux. So there's room for that, and then there's room for the larger things, like Drouin has. So I guess it's the internationalization of our industry here, and the attractiveness of as a business to things like venture capital that even 10, 15 years ago wasn't happening.
And for Cooper Mountain itself, obviously a lot of growth and very recent growth with the addition of Arbor Brook, which you mentioned. What are you hoping for its future?
Well, I'm hoping for it to be sustainable enough to be able to be an entity. There's a certain economic size that things have to be if they're going to sustain themselves. There are many hundreds of 1,000 wineries now in Oregon, but really, honestly, 30 years from now, I doubt if 20% of them will be in existence. Although they may be growing grapes, but somebody different will be doing it. And so we're hoping for something more sustainable that will continue on.
So we recently saw at the 2023 Wine Symposium you were given an industry award, and congratulations on that. I'm curious what that means to you after a career in wine.
Well, I think what it meant to me, frankly, was the recognition of organics and biodynamics as a real thing, not some kind of strange offshoot. I mean that it's really becoming mainstream, and so I felt very good about contributing to that. What most people don't understand actually as well is that the great wineries in France, at least 50 to 60% of them, if not more, are organic and biodynamic. They just don't advertise it.
On that note, obviously we talked to Gilles earlier and we asked him a similar question. How have you seen the growth of organics and biodynamics in the Oregon industry? And what do you see for the kind of the future of that type of farming here?
Well, I think it just seems to be increasing every day, the amount of interest in organics and biodynamics. Again, because the ultimate is because it improves the quality of the grapes and the wine. And so that, you know, whether people believe in any of the theories, and there are some pretty out there theories in terms of these, particularly biodynamics, it's really, the proof is in the bottle.
Mm-hmm. All right, last question for you. Looking back, what is your greatest achievement? What are you proudest of?
I think I'm proudest of putting this whole system together. You know, it's not just the brand. It's the people. It's mostly the people. That we put the Sanchez family and Gilles and a lot of other people into some kind of big system. It's a wine family, and that's been my greatest achievement, is creating a wine family.
That's all the questions that I have for you. Is there anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything?
No, I think they did fine. Can't
no complaints. That's always good.
No, I hope so. Hope I didn't do any gaffes.
No, it was fantastic. Thank you so much for your time and for sharing this beautiful space with us and sharing your stories with us.
I hope it makes it to the archives okay.